Part 1. First light at the King's Mill. The river spoke first. It always did at Greymill. Before the bell at Ardenmarch Hall, 3 leagues to the west, before the wood pigeons in the willow stand, before the small slat window let in any color at all, the slow, pale green Ardenwater spoke at the sluice gate, and at the foot of the wheel, and along the riverside wall of the mill house, in the long, even, low note that Saryn Greymill had been hearing every morning of her life for 23 winters. She opened her eyes and lay still a moment in the small straw and wool bed, listening. The note was clean. The river was running its summer flow, pale, clear green at the head of the valley. No upstream rain coming down from the high moor yet. No autumn slack. A good morning to grind. She put her bare feet on the cold-dressed gray river stone floor and reached for her tunic in the dim. The tunic was bleached pale cream linen, plain, hem worn dark from 12 winters of meal bin and flour dust. She pulled it over her head and tied the small bone toggle at the throat with the thin wax cord. Then the dark slate-gray close-woven wool short skirt, knee-length plain pleated. Then the dark moss-green wool leggings under the skirt, tucked into the tall, plain, dark walnut-brown leather boots that had been her mother's and that she had resoled 3 times. She laced the boots up the front with dark wax cord, neat, even. The bleached cream linen apron came last, heavy, stiff at the seams, a soft, pale flower gray across the front from the meal bin. She tied it behind the back with the 2 long, pale wax cord ties and pulled the knot tight and quiet. She stood and reached up to the wide leather belt on its dark iron peg above the chest at the foot of the bed. The belt was dark walnut-brown, plain. The small brass meal sieve clipped at the right hip. The small dark iron grain key clipped at the left hip. The key that opened the granary loft door at the head of the oak ladder upstairs and the lock-up door behind the meal bin floor down here. The small leather wallet at the small of the back, where she kept the line's hidden ledger pages. She reached up and gathered her hair. It was long, ash blonde, straight, loose to the mid-back when she slept. She drew it forward over the right shoulder in a single rope, divided it into 3 thick falls and plaited it down to the end. She tied the end with the small, dark iron clip. The braid hung in front of her now, neat and heavy, the way it had hung in her mother's front during work and in her grandmother's before that. She tied the pale gray linen kerchief over the crown of the head. She picked up the small, dark iron candle from the wax taper bench and lit it from the banked coal in the stone edge of the cold hearth. A small, soft, pale flame. Loom came in from the kitchen door without sound. The wolf lifted her head once at Saryn and lay her chin on Saryn's left boot and was still. Pale silver cream coat. Smoky charcoal mask across the muzzle and the brow. Smoky charcoal ears. Pale ice blue eyes, the same ice blue as Saryn's. Loom had come to her hand at 6 weeks of age from a litter at the lower river bend, a winter after Linnet had died. "Good morning," Saryn said low and even, the same low pitch every morning. The wolf's tail moved once on the stone floor. She went to the kitchen door and looked out across the small flagstoned wheelyard. The river beyond was just beginning to take color. A thin, pale, clear green, a little mist standing off the water, the willow stand on the inland side of the road still gray, the eastern sky just beginning to pale. She crossed the yard with the candle held low, the wolf at her left heel, and went round the riverside of the mill house to the long oak sluice lever standing against the inland wall. The lever was heavy. It had been heavy when Linnet had let her work it the first time at age 7, and it was heavy now. She set her shoulder to it and pushed up and across in one slow, steady arc. The oak sluice gate at the head of the mill leat lifted a clean, pale green fall of cold river water, and the water came down the leat in a long, slow rope and broke onto the buckets of the heavy oak overshot water wheel. The wheel began to turn. She stood a moment and watched it turn. The deep, low rumble that the mill was named for began under her feet through the wet flagstones. "Mother," she said low and even, almost without sound, the way she said it every morning at the wheel, a word for the small dressed gray river stone marker set into the south wall of the mill house, the one that read, Linnet. And then, because Merwin's marker stood beside it, she said, "Grandmother." 2 words to the river and the wheel and the morning and the rumble that was already the long, even low note of grinding day at Greymill. Then she went back inside. The meal bin floor was the lowest floor of the mill house, a long plank-floored chamber along the riverside wall with the long, shallow oak meal bin running its full length under the meal spouts that came down from the millstone floor above. The small slat window in the riverside wall was just beginning to let in the damp green river light, pale and slanted. She set the candle on its small dark iron stand by the kitchen door, blew it out, the slat window light was enough now, and crossed to the foot of the steep oak ladder that climbed to the millstone floor. She climbed. The millstone floor smelt of dry stone, warm dry oak, the faint clean dustiness of yesterday's grinding. 2 pairs of stones, fine wheat on the left, coarse rye on the right, both dressed by her own hand inside the past 2 months. She climbed the second ladder up to the grain loft above. The dark iron grain key from her left hip turned the lock with the long, even low scrape she had heard every morning for 12 winters. Inside, 6 oak-hooped sacks of king's wheat, 4 of king's rye, each sealed at the throat with the small dark iron Ardenwater wheel mark. The king's warrant tally hung on the inside of the door, a long, pale willow rod, notched for each bushel, signed in by Reeve Vakor Stenkill 3 days ago. She stood a moment with her hand on the warrant tally. The notches were 6 and 4, the warrant said wheat and rye. She had counted 6 wheat sacks and 4 rye sacks into the loft when Vakor's cart had stood in the wheel yard 3 days ago. She had counted them again that night at second bell. She unbound the throat of the first wheat sack, set the small dark iron seal carefully aside on the loft shelf, and lifted the open sack to the hopper of the fine wheat pear through the small hopper hatch in the loft floor. The grain poured down into the hopper a clean pale gold, plump kernels, clean. She stood and watched the grain go down. It looked clean. It almost always did at the loft hatch. The grain Vakor sent looked, at first sight, like the king's grain. The first sample she ever pulled, when she was 12, and Linnet still living, had also looked clean. It was the meal bin that told the truth. She tied off the throat of the open sack with a thin wax cord, climbed down to the millstone floor, and pulled the short, dark iron lever that opened the hopper shoe. The grain began to feed slow and steady down into the eye of the runner stone. The 2 stones, the runner above and the bedstone below, the both of them dressed 3 weeks ago, closed on the grain with their small, even low rumble within the great low rumble of the wheel, and the meal began to come out at the meal spout below. She climbed down the first ladder to the meal bin floor. The meal was already pouring out at the spout end of the fine wheat side of the meal bin into the small bone-white linen sack, pale and warm, dust rising fine and pale into the slat window light. She let the bin fill a quarter full, and then she pulled the lever back to the closed position, and the spout slowed and stopped. She took a small pinch of meal from the sack between thumb and finger and rubbed it. The first time she had ever done this, age 6. With Linnet's hand over her hand and Linnet's voice low and even at her ear, Linnet had said, "Clean wheat is cool to the finger and goes down in a slick. Chalk is also slick, but chalk goes a thin dust into the lines of the hand and stays there. Bone meal is warm to the finger and a little sweet on the tongue. Coarse rye is a darker speckle and a faint bitter on the tongue. Pure wheat is just clean and cool and slick and a little nutty." Saryn rubbed the pinch. It was clean, cool, slick, a little nutty. The first bushel of the king's true wheat from Vakor's last delivery 3 days ago was clean. She did not let her shoulders go down. She had learned that as well. The first bushel of any of his deliveries was clean. She took the small, bone-white linen sack from the spout end and set it carefully on the meal bin shelf above the meal bin. She marked it with a small charcoal stroke on the side, 1 stroke for the first measure of grinding day. She would mark each measure of the day with 1 more stroke as it went through. Then she went down on 1 knee at the inland end of the meal bin floor, lifted up the 3rd dark walnut-brown plank from the wall, and turned it over. On the underside of the plank, cut deep with a small knife tip, were chalk marks, 9 winters of them, a small notch for each pinch of chalk-cut meal she had pulled out of one of Vakor's later sacks. She had begun cutting them at age 14, 6 months after Linnet's winter fever had taken her. When Saryn had at last understood what was happening in the deeper sacks, her mother had also understood and had not lived long enough to bring to a king. There were 316 marks on the plank. The fresh one was 4th from the right at the foot of the plank. A small, clean notch she had cut 3 days ago when she had pulled the 3rd wheat sack of Vakor's last delivery out of the loft and had pulled a pinch of its meal at the bin and had rubbed it and had felt the dust go into the lines of her hand and stay there. Chalk, pale chalk dust, cut into the wheat. The whole 3rd sack had been cut. 316. She set the plank back gently and stood, the small dark iron grain key still at her left hip, the small leather wallet still at the small of the back, the long ash blonde rope braid still heavy at her right shoulder. A short knock came at the kitchen door. "Saryn!" It was Hetty's voice, quiet, careful, watchful. "Come." The door opened a handspan, and Hetty Threshold's face came through, sand-blonde hair plaited at her back, ice-gray eyes wide. The girl was 14. She had been carrying meal sacks at Greymill for 2 winters. She always came at first light on a grinding day. The column. Saryn waited. Hetty was a quiet child. She would say it short. Grandfather sent me up. He says they were on the river road at Ardenmarch dawn bell. Mounted column, 15 riders. Pennants. The pennants Hetty meant were the green and pewter wheelmark pennants of the Aldrichson of Ardenmarch. The King's Column. The late summer harvest tour. She had been waiting for it for 9 months. She had been waiting for it, in some longer sense, for 9 winters. How many leagues? 3. Ardenmarch Hall is 3 leagues. Grandfather says early afternoon, maybe an hour past noon, maybe earlier if they ride hard. They will ride steady. The king rides steady on his own roads. Hetty nodded. Saryn drew breath. It was the breath she had drawn the morning Linnet had died 9 winters ago. The breath that goes in slow and comes out plain. Get up to the loft and pull the 2nd wheat sack out for the 2nd measure. I will come up. Yes. And Hetty waited. Tell your grandfather, what? The bundle. I will come for it before noon. Hetty's small face was very still. She knew the bundle. She had known the bundle for 2 winters. She was the only other person living at Greymill who knew the bundle. She nodded once and turned and was gone up the ladder. Saryn stood a moment alone on the meal bin floor. Loom was at her left boot. The small slat window let in the damp green river light, slanted, pale. The deep, low rumble of the wheel went on under her feet. The first measure of grinding day was finished and sacked. There were 18 more measures to be ground today, 12 of fine wheat, 6 of coarse rye, to fill the king's warrant of Vacor's last delivery. There would be no grinding tomorrow. There would be the king's column at the mill yard tomorrow at high noon, if she set the test up right today. She had gone over it in her mind for 9 winters, the form of it, the order of it, the way to lay it down, the bundle from Matisse, the chalk meal sample of Vacor's 3rd sack from 3 days ago, the small notched plank from the meal bin floor, the king's warrant tally from the loft door, the open sack of cut meal still in the loft, untouched. Mattis's signed vellum. She would lay them at the king's foot at the mill yard test in the order she had set down in her head 100 mornings. Warrant 1st, plank 2nd, bundle 3rd, vellum 4th, the open chalk sack last. She walked the 4 paces back to the kitchen and pulled her dark walnut-brown wool short cloak off the peg by the kitchen door. She would walk to the willow-cottage now and bring the bundle back herself before the morning was much further on. Mattis would be sitting at his door waiting. He had been sitting at his door at first light every morning for 3 days, since Vacor's last cart had come down the river road. She would not let him carry the bundle, the 100 paces, in his own slow walk on his own old hand. Loom rose from the boot and stood at her left heel. Stay, Saryn said, low and even. The wolf's tail moved once. The wolf sat. She would stay at the meal bin floor until Saryn came back. Saryn opened the kitchen door. The river light was a little stronger now. Pale, clear green, on the slow water, the willow stand standing pale. The slow, heavy turn of the wheel went on. The deep, low rumble went on under everything. She set off across the wheel yard at a steady plain walk towards the river road and the willow-cottage and Matthis threshold and 9 winters of pale willow-rod tally sticks bound in dark iron wire above an old man's hearth. The morning was beginning. The king was on the river road. The line of Greymill was about to be put down at last in plain hand for plain hearing. She did not run. Her mother had not run. Her grandmother had not run. They had stood at the wheel, and they had ground clean meal, and they had let the river speak first. She walked. Part 2. The Reeve at the Sluice. Matthis Threshold was sitting at the door of the willow-cottage when Saryn came up the river road from the mill, just as Hetty had said he would be. The heavy oak walking stick was leaning against the wall beside his stool. The clouded right eye sat half-closed against the morning sun. The clear ice-blue left eye was on the road already and saw her come. Saryn. Matthis. She stopped at the small flagstone before his stool. The willow stand stood pale at her left, the river beyond running its slow pale green over its long, slow pebbles. The morning was warming. The column is at Ardenmarch, she said. Hetty told me. 3 leagues! Hetty told me. He did not move. He was looking at her face. He had known her face every day of her life, and he had known her mother's face for 19 winters, and he had known her grandmother's face for 50. He could read her face the way she could read meal between her fingers. "Today is the day," he said at last. "Tomorrow is the day. Tomorrow. At high noon, at the mill yard, with the sluice open, with Vakor at the door." He let out a breath. It was a long one, a breath with 60 winters in it. So the writ, at last. If the king will hear me, he will hear you. You don't know that. I knew his grandfather. The grandfather walked our road at 14 years old in the famine winter, and he took bread out of your grandmother's hand on a long pewter plate at the kitchen table at Greymill in the snow. The grandfather will be in this one. The grandfather will be in him today. She said nothing. She did not know if she believed it, but she had heard Mattis say it before, every winter on Sverre's death day, when he and Linnet would walk down to the south wall of the mill house and stand at Merwin's marker, and Linnet's marker would speak Sverre's name in low, even voices. "The bundle," she said. He stood with the help of the heavy oak walking stick. The stand was slow. He went into the willow-cottage, and she stayed at the threshold. Inside was the cold, swept hearth, the low straw and wool bed, the small, dark walnut-brown trestle table, the single chair. He set the walking stick against the table and reached up with both his old hands to the rafter-beam above the hearth. The bundle came down, pale willow rods, 9 of them, 1 for each winter, each rod about 18 inches long, neatly tied at the head and the foot with small, dark iron wire. On each rod, small notches, a small notch at the head for each pound of in-weight short, a small cross at the foot for each pound of chalk meal substituted at the outweight. 9 winters of cart trips between Greymill and the granary at Ardenmarch Hall, 3 days a week of his own life, 812 cart trips. He brought the bundle out and set it carefully into her open hands. Both his hands closed over hers a moment. "There, the line stands in your hand now. And the vellum. Here." He reached into the small leather pouch at his hip and brought out a single small folded square of bleached gray vellum. The fold was tight. The small dark iron seal at the foot was cut in his own mark, a small letter T inside a small wheel. "Dates and times of Vakor's cart down the river road to Brookford at second bell of night. 37 of them, 2 winters' worth, signed in my own hand. Read it on the way back." She slid the vellum into the small leather wallet at the small of the back, beneath the pale gray kerchief on her crown. The bundle she carried in both hands close at her chest under the dark walnut-brown short cloak. "Mathis. Saryn. After, when the writ is signed, the line will name Hetty as my apprentice in plain hand, so she stands written into it from the start. That was Linnet's wish for any daughter of yours that ever came up to the mill, and it is mine." The old man's clear, ice-blue left eye blinked once. He nodded. He did not speak. He was a man who had spent 40 winters listening to a watercourse, and he had learned the long pause of a man who has seen what should not be put into words. "Go," he said. "He will be at the river road earlier than Hetty said. The column rides steady, but a king rides at the head of it. Go." She turned back to the river road and walked. The bundle was warm under the cloak from his old hands. The river was running its long, even low note. Her ash-blonde rope braid lay heavy on the right side of her chest. Loom came out of the willow stand at the foot of the road and fell in at her left heel without being called. By the time she reached the wheel yard, the morning had gone all the way to a clear, pale gold light over the slow, pale green water. The wheel was still turning steady. The first measure of fine wheat was sacked clean on the meal bin shelf. The second measure of fine wheat was already coming down the spout into the second, small, bone-white linen sack. Hetty had pulled the second wheat sack out of the loft and set it grinding while Saryn was up at the willow-cottage. The girl had done it well. The hopper was feeding clean and steady. Saryn went into her own 2-room dwelling at the inland end of the lower floor and knelt at the foot of the bed. She unfastened the iron-bound chest with the small dark iron grain key. The same key opened the chest as the granary loft and the lockup, a single key for the line's 3 locks, lifted the lid, and laid the bundle of 9 pale willow rods carefully inside next to her grandmother's hammer and pick for stone dressing and her mother's set of brass meal sieves. She closed the lid. She locked it. She rose. She went back to the meal bin floor. Hetty was at the foot of the ladder, watching the second sack fill at the spout end. "I will take the wheat side," Saryn said. "You take the rye side at the 3rd measure." "Yes." She climbed up to the millstone floor and stood between the 2 pairs of stones. She watched the runner stone of the fine wheat pear turning in its slow, steady arc inside the great, low rumble of the wheel. She looked at the gudgeon pin where the iron passed through the riverside wall. Everything was running the way it should run on a clean grinding day. She climbed further to the loft and pulled out the third wheat sack. She set it on the loft shelf and broke the small dark iron seal at the throat. The king's wheel mark on the soft red wax was clean, undisturbed since Vacor's last sealing 3 days ago. She looked at the grain. The third sack was the cut one. She had known it 3 days ago when she had pulled a pinch from the spout end at the second measure, the one that had given her the new notch on the meal bin plank. She lifted the open sack and weighed it with her hand. It was the king's weight to the tip of the finger. The grain looked at the loft hatch like the king's grain, plump kernels at the top of the sack. The cut chalk dust was lower down, cut into the body of the grain, where the eye did not reach until the meal poured at the spout below. Vacor was a careful man. She set the sack aside on the loft shelf without grinding it. Today, the third measure of fine wheat would be the fourth wheat sack from the loft. Clean, she had checked. The third sack, the cut one, would be set aside unground, sealed at the throat, kept for the king's foot at the millyard test tomorrow. She climbed back down to the meal bin floor. She took her plain bleached gray wool kerchief from her cloak pocket, the second one, smaller, that she carried for the line's testimony, and laid it on the meal bin shelf. Then, with the small brass meal sieve, she sieved a single careful measure of meal from the second sack of grinding, the clean second measure that was just finishing at the spout, into the kerchief. 2 tablespoons of pale gold flour, clean, warm. She tied the corners of the kerchief tight with a single thin pale wax cord. The third measure she would sieve out of the meal of the third sack, the cut one, once it was ground at the king's call tomorrow at the test. 2 samples, side by side, would lie at the king's foot. Clean Greymill wheat and Vacor's cut. She set the small, clean wheat kerchief aside in the small leather wallet at her belt. It was the second hour past dawn when she heard the cart on the river road. A heavy cart, 2 horses, the sound of an oak axle on dressed flagstones. The cart was coming up from the west, from Ardenmarch Hall direction, not from the east where Brookford lay. Vacor. Hetty had heard it too. The girl was at the foot of the wheat side ladder with her small bleached cream linen apron on. She looked up at Saryn with her ice gray eyes wide. Saryn put a hand once flat on the air. Steady. Get back to the rye side. Sieve at the spout. Be working. Do not look at him. Yes. The cart pulled up in the wheel yard. 2 horses, dark bay, harnessed. The cart was empty in the bed, except for an oak chest bound with 3 dark iron straps and a small dark iron handle on the lid. The granary-reeve's writing chest. Reeve, Vacor, Stenkill climbed down off the seat, heavy on his soft boots, breathing through the mouth, and his 2 assistants stayed up with the horses. He walked across the wheel yard with his heavy footfall on the wet flagstones, and the floor of the meal bin chamber warned of him under Saryn's feet before he came through the kitchen door. He came in. Greymill. Reeve Stenkill. He stood in the kitchen door, pale chalk-fair skin, sallow, soft at the throat, thin sandy gray hair cropped close, pale washed-out blue eyes that did not look quite at her face but at the air just past her left shoulder. Dark slate gray wool short coat with the dark iron toggles. Dark iron granary-reeve pin at the throat. Heavy oak granary warrant tally stick at the right hip. On King's business. On King's business, Saryn said, the form of it. A miller set it back to a granary-reeve at the door. I will inspect the lockup. It is open to you. And the loft. It is open to you. And the in-weight ledger of the past King's quarter. It hangs by the kitchen door. He looked at her face for the first time. She kept her face plain. The ice-blue eyes did not move. The braid of ash blonde at her right shoulder did not move. The bleached cream linen apron at her front did not move. He looked away again. He inspected the in-weight ledger first, the public one, 15 winters of in-weights and out-weights, signed by Merwin, Linnet, and Saryn. The fine tally Mathis had been keeping of the true weights at the granary scale was not in the public ledger. It was in the bundle in the iron-bound chest in her sleeping room. He turned the pages slow with his thick fingers and found nothing because there was nothing in the public ledger to find. He set the ledger back on its peg. The lockup. She unlocked the lockup with the dark iron grain key. The small dressed gray riverstone room behind the meal bin floor opened on its hinges. Inside, on the small, dark, walnut-brown shelves along the inland wall, were 11 oak-hooped sacks of finished meal from the past king's quarter, the each one tied at the throat with the small wax cord and marked with a small charcoal stroke for the measure number. Valcor walked the room, lifted each sack, weighed it with his hand, counted them. 11. The king's warrant said 11. He went out. The loft. She climbed the ladder and unlocked the granary loft door. He climbed slowly behind her, breathing hard. He counted the sacks. 6 wheat, 4 rye, less the 2 she had already opened for grinding. He looked at the warrant tally on the inside of the door. 6 and 4. He turned. Greymill. Reeve Stenkill. I am told the king's column is at Ardenmarch this morning. So I am told. It is the king's pleasure to come down the river road in his late summer harvest tour. He may come to Greymill. He may not. As the king pleases. He looked at her for the second time. The pale, washed-out blue eyes were a little narrowed now. He had inspected and found nothing. He had counted and found nothing. He had read the public ledger and found nothing. But he was not a stupid man. He had been stealing 9 winters, and he had not been stealing 9 winters by being stupid. Greymill. Reeve Stenkill. If the king should come, and a miller should be asked any question by a king, there is a thing a miller of Greymill might want to remember. The king's grain has been ground here a long winter. The king's grain need not be ground here forever. There is a mill at Brookford that has stood empty in its lower stones for 2 winters. It can grind for the keep table tomorrow if the king's word goes that way. A miller who has the king's grinding has the king's silver. A miller who does not, does not. She did not speak. The line of Greymill, he said, is a long line. 3 winters since I came down the river road, and your mother was at the wheel yard sluice. She also remembered. Your grandmother also remembered. She did not speak. He waited a beat. I will be back at second bell of night for the bagged-out weight of the past king's quarter, as is your right by the warrant. As is my right by the warrant. He turned and went down the ladder slow. She closed the granary loft door, locked it, climbed down behind him. He went back across the meal bin floor and through the kitchen door and across the wheel yard to his cart. His 2 assistants were still up. He climbed up heavy. He did not look back. The cart went down the river road towards Ardenmarch Hall, the 2 dark bay horses at a steady walk, the heavy oak axle on the dressed flagstones until it crossed onto the dirt. Saryn stood a long moment at the kitchen door. Loom came out of the meal bin floor and lay her chin once across Saryn's left boot. The wolf had been in the lockup the whole time, lying flat on the dressed gray river stone, watching from under the lowest shelf. Saryn had not seen her go in. Loom had heard the cart sooner than Saryn had heard it. Hetty came in from the rye-side ladder, her small face white at the cheekbones, her ice-gray eyes wide. He said about your mother, about your grandmother. He did. What does he says a thing when he is afraid. He has said the same thing for 9 winters. I have not put it into the king's hand for 9 winters because I did not have the king. Now I have the king. Now we put it into the king's hand. Hetty nodded once. Saryn walked 4 steps to the kitchen table, took out a single small square of bleached gray vellum from the small dark walnut-brown writing box, and dipped a small dark iron quill in the small dark iron ink pot. She wrote in plain hand, 4 short lines, in the long, even low pitch she spoke in, low, even, and short. She folded the vellum once. She set the small dark iron seal of Greymill, a small G inside a small wheel, into a soft, pale red wax at the fold. She gave it to Hetty. Captain Bran Halsig will be at the head of the column 3 paces behind the king. You give it to him at the wheel yard when they pull up. Not to the king, not to any other rider, to the captain. Plain, short, the miller's word for the king. Yes. Then come back inside and stand at the rye side spout and grind the 3rd rye measure. Be working when the king comes through the kitchen door. Yes. The girl tucked the small folded vellum into her own small bleached cream linen apron at the waist. She turned once to look at Saryn, the ice-gray eyes wide. Then she went out across the wheel yard to the mouth of the river road to wait. Saryn went back to the wheat-side ladder. The 3rd measure of fine wheat was waiting. She climbed, the wheel turned, the river ran. The line of Greymill was 316 marks deep on the underside of a dark walnut-brown plank in the meal bin floor, and the long ash-blonde rope braid of a 3rd-generation miller of the Ardenwater throne lay heavy on the right side of her chest as she set her hand to the lever of the hopper shoe and let the king's true grain begin to feed. Part 3. The King at the Mill Door. The king's column came down the river road 1 hour past noon. Hetty was at the mouth of the river road already. She had been there since she had carried the small folded vellum across the wheel yard, a quiet child standing very still in her bleached cream linen apron at the foot of an old willow on the inland edge of the road. Saryn watched her from the small slat window in the riverside wall of the meal bin floor, the third measure of fine wheat sacked clean on the meal bin shelf at her right hand, the fourth measure already running down the spout into the fourth small bone-white linen sack beside it. The dust came first, pale gold dust on the river road at the line of the long willow stand 1/2 league west, 15 riders at a steady walk, mounted, a single small green and pewter wheelmark pennant at the head, a second pennant a single horse behind. Saryn saw the king before she could have named him. He was at the head. He sat tall, he sat steady, he did not lean. The horse beneath him was a dark bay, tall stallion with a long, deep charcoal mane. At the king's left walked a great, deep charcoal gray wolf with a white throat blaze. She closed the lever of the hopper shoe. The fourth measure stopped at the spout. She took her plain bleached cream linen apron in her 2 hands, once at the front, and shook the flour dust off it once, gentle, and stepped back from the meal bin and stood plain. She would not run. The column came up the river road past the willow-cottage without breaking the steady walk. Mathis was at his door, on the small, dark, walnut-brown, 3-legged stool, the heavy oak walking stick at his side, the clouded right eye half closed, the clear, ice-blue left eye on the column. The king turned his head once at Mathis as he rode past and inclined the head a single small slow inclination, the way a man inclines his head to a man who has stood at the door of his country 60 winters. Mathis inclined his head once back. The king rode on. At the mouth of the wheel yard, the captain at the head, a man of 45 winters in a dark slate-gray wool short coat with a small dark iron captain's pin at the throat. Iron gray hair cropped close, ruddy windburn on the high cheekbones, held up his hand, and the column halted on the river road. The king himself rode the horse the 4 paces into the wheel yard, slow, and dismounted clean at the mill door without turning his back to the captain. Hetty crossed the 4 paces from the willow at a quiet walk and stopped at the captain's stirrup. She looked up. Captain. Girl. Bran Halsig looked down. His clear, pale, washed-out gray eyes were quiet. He had been a king's captain 3 winters under King Galen, and 16 winters under King Aldric the Quiet before him. He knew a small folded vellum at the hand of a quiet child for what it was. For the king, from Greymill. The miller's word. Plain. Short. He took the small folded vellum out of her small flour-dusted hand. He looked at it once. He looked at the king at the mill door. The king had turned. The king had seen. Captain, bring it. Bran Halsig dismounted clean and crossed the wheel yard with the small folded vellum held flat in his right palm, his sword still at his left hip in its plain dark walnut-brown leather scabbard. He held the small folded vellum out to the king. The king took it, broke the small dark iron seal of Greymill in the soft pale red wax with one slow careful turn of the thumb, and read. He read once, he read it slow. Saryn could see him from the kitchen door now. She had stepped 4 paces from the meal bin to the kitchen door plain, and she stood there in the plain bleached cream linen apron with the long ash-blonde rope braid heavy on the right side of her chest. The wolf loom sat at her left boot, ice-blue eyes on the king's wolf at the king's left heel. The deep charcoal gray wolf returned the look once and then was still. The king finished reading. He folded the small vellum once again and set it carefully into the small leather pouch at his right hip. He looked up. He looked across the wheel yard at the kitchen door of the mill house and met Saryn's face for the first time in his life, and her face for the first time in his. He walked the 4 paces across the wheel yard. He did not stride. He walked. The wolf walked at his left heel. The 4 small green and pewter buttons at the throat of his bone-white linen tunic were a soft, pale river light. The dark, espresso-brown, wavy hair tied at the nape with the dark wax cord caught the late afternoon sun. The deep, amber-brown eyes were level on her face from 10 paces, then from 6, then from 3. He stopped at the threshold of the kitchen door. He stood at his full height. She stood at hers. The plank floor of the mill house was level. The dressed flagstones of the wheel yard were level. The kitchen door was a low oak door that he had to lower his head a single inch to come through, and so he came through it lowering the head a single inch, and inside the kitchen on the plank floor he was tall again, at the full height. She was not short. She came to the bridge of his nose. He did not lean down. She did not look up. He stood. She stood. They met level on the plank floor of the kitchen of a king's mill on the south bank of the slow pale green Ardenwater on a clear afternoon of a late summer harvest tour. Saryn Greymill. My king. Your hand, then. He held out his right hand. The Aldrichson signet of dark iron was on the third finger, the Ardenwater wheel mark cut into the face. She put her right hand, small and flower pale, into his. The king's hand was large and weathered and dry, the back marked with the small old chip scar of a hayfork at age 12. He held her hand a beat. He let it go. I have read your note. My king. You asked the king to come tomorrow at high noon, not today, to stand at the mill yard with the reeve at the door and the sluice open, to witness. Yes, my king. You do not ask the king to take a man tonight at second bell. No, my king. You ask for the test in plain sight, plain hand, plain hour. Yes, my king. He waited a beat. The deep amber-brown eyes did not move. He was a man who had learned at his grandfather's side in a mill house at age 9 that millers listen first. Why? Because the line of Greymill is 3 winters of women who held the wheel and 3 winters of women who did not lift their hands against the keep without the king's eyes on the lifting. My grandmother did not. My mother did not. I will not. The king's law sits at the mill yard at high noon with the reeve at the door and the sluice open, or it does not sit at all. That is the line of the line. He looked at her a long beat. Show me the wheel. Yes, my king. She stepped past him through the kitchen door. He stood aside one slow, careful step on the plank to let her pass first. She did not hesitate. She went, and out into the wheel yard. The deep, low rumble of the wheel was a steady background under the slow, pale green water. The fall of cold river water from the sluice gate onto the buckets of the heavy oak, overshot water wheel was a clean, steady rope. The wolf loom came at her left heel. The wolf sten came at the king's left heel. The 2 wolves walked at a respectful step apart and did not look at each other again. Saryn brought him round the riverside of the mill house. She showed him the wheel. 12 paces across, 24 oak buckets, the heavy dark iron gudgeon pin passing through the inland wall. He stood and watched the wheel turn a slow, steady arc for the long count of 12. He inclined his head once to her. Merwin's wheel. My grandmother's wheel. My grandfather sat at the small, dressed gray river stone seat at the south of the wheel yard for 9 afternoons in his 14th winter. He told me the count of buckets. He told me the rope of water at the sluice. He sent me at age 9 to your mother's hand at the same wheel yard with a small sack of his own ground meal in my own small hand, ground in the kitchen quern at Ardenmarch by his own old hand. He wanted me to see what a miller's clean meal looked like next to a king's old quern meal. I saw. The line remembers, my king. The line remembers. He walked back round to the kitchen door at her side. The captain stood at the wheel yard mouth, the column held on the river road 2 paces behind the captain's back. The 2 pennants of green and pewter wheel mark moved very slow in the river air. Inside, on the meal bin floor, the king walked the long, shallow oak meal bin once at her side. He looked at the 4 small, bone-white linen sacks on the meal bin shelf, each marked with 1 small charcoal stroke for the measure number, the pale gold flour heavy in them. He stopped at the second sack, the one Hetty had ground while Saryn had been at the willow-cottage. Saryn took down the small, bleached gray wool kerchief she had set aside earlier from the meal bin shelf and untied the corners. My king. She held the kerchief level at her open palm. 2 tablespoons of pale gold flour, clean, warm. She had sieved it from the second sack at the spout end with the small brass meal sieve at the second hour of the morning. This is the king's wheat ground at the king's mill in plain hand, from the second wheat sack of Reeve Stenkel's last delivery 3 days ago, sieved by my own hand at the second hour of this morning. He held out his right hand. She tipped a careful pinch into his palm. He brought the pinch up to his face. He smelled it once. He wet the tip of his right index finger on the inside of his lower lip and pressed the wet finger into the meal in the palm and brought the finger to the tongue. He held a beat at the tongue. Then he nodded once. Clean, cool, slick, a little nutty. The king's wheat from the king's mill from the king's miller's hand. Yes, my king. He took the kerchief from her open palm with both his hands and folded the corners again. Careful. And set it into the small leather pouch at his right hip beside the small folded vellum. Tomorrow at high noon, he said, I will sit at my grandfather's seat at the south of the wheel yard. The reeve will stand at the kitchen door under the captain's hand. The sluice will be open, the wheel will turn, you will grind 2 measures in plain sight, in plain hand. The first measure from a sack you choose at this hour, the second measure from a sack the reeve chooses at this hour. The captain will set the seal on both sacks now. You will lay what you have to lay at the king's foot when the second measure has run. Yes, my king, you agree to it? Yes, my king, the line agrees. Then choose. She walked the king to the granary loft. He climbed the oak ladder behind her, slow, careful of the ladder, his hand once at her shoulder for balance at the 3rd rung, a small light hand, no weight, and once again on the loft shelf above. She unlocked the loft door with the dark iron grain key, and they stood inside. 6 oak-hooped sacks of king's wheat, 4 oak-hooped sacks of king's rye. 2 of the wheat already open for the day's grinding, the 1st and the 2nd, 1 set aside on the loft shelf still sealed, the 3rd, the cut one, 3 still standing along the inland wall. She set her hand on the 3rd sack on the loft shelf, the one with the small dark iron seal of the wheel mark still unbroken, the one that she had pulled out of the loft this morning and not ground. She did not say what it was. She did not need to. She had told him in her 4 lines on the small folded vellum that there would be 1 sack she would name, and 1 sack the reeve would name. This sack, my king, this is the one I will name. Captain Halsig will set the seal on it now. Yes, my king. He turned and called down the loft hatch in his low, even pitch. Captain, bring the king's seal. The captain came up the ladder. He carried the king's small, dark iron seal stamp in his right palm and a small, soft, pale red wax stick in his left. He set the seal across the throat cord of the 3rd sack in a soft, pale red wax. The king's wheel mark cut clean inside the small, pale red disc. The 3rd sack was now under the king's seal. It would stand at the king's foot tomorrow at high noon. And the reeve's choice? At the reeve's hand, tomorrow when he comes, he may pick any of the remaining 3 wheat sacks or any of the 4 rye sacks at his own hand. I will grind it in plain sight. Then it stands. Then it stands, my king. He climbed down the ladder slow. He went out across the meal bin floor to the kitchen door. He stopped at the kitchen door and turned once at the threshold and looked back at her on the plank floor where she stood beside the meal bin. Plain, the long ash-blonde rope braid heavy at her right shoulder, the wolf at her left boot. Saryn Greymill. My king. Sleep tonight. The line will stand tomorrow. My king. He went out. The captain went after him. The column took up the steady walk and pulled back to the long willow stand, half a league west, where they would camp for the night under the king's tents on the dressed flagstones of the road's broad widening. 2 riders stayed at the wheelyard mouth, quiet riders in dark slate-gray wool, hands plain on their reins. The reeve, Saryn would learn an hour later from Hetty, had been taken at his cart on the road from Brookford by the captain's outrider an hour before the king had come, and was held in plain hand at the king's tent under the captain's 2 men. Saryn stood a long moment at the kitchen door. The river ran its long, even low note. The wheel turned its slow, steady arc. The sun sat low and pale gold over the slow, pale green water. She drew breath, the breath that goes in slow and comes out plain. She closed the kitchen door. She had 8 more measures to grind today before she let the wheel rest. The line of Greymill ground the king's grain on grinding day. She went back to the wheat-side ladder and climbed. Part 4. The test at the wheel yard. High noon came clear over the slow, pale green Ardenwater on the 2nd day. The mist of the morning long burnt off, the late summer sun standing pale gold straight overhead, the willow stand standing pale on the inland side of the river road. The wheel yard had been swept clean of last evening's flower dust at first light by Hetty's hand and Saryn's, the dressed gray flagstones a soft, pale gray under the noon sun. The river ran its long, even low note. The wheel turned its slow, steady arc. The king's column came down the river road at the head of the noon hour. They came at a steady walk and they pulled up at the mouth of the wheel yard at the willow stand, 12 riders behind the 2 pennants, the king at the head on the dark bay tall stallion, the captain 3 paces behind him at the head of the column. The deep charcoal gray wolf walked at the king's left heel. The king dismounted clean at the wheel yard mouth. He walked across the dressed flagstones at his slow level walk to the small, low-dressed gray river stone seat at the south end of the yard. His grandfather's seat, the small pewter wheel mark set into the head of the backrest. He sat. The wolf lay at his left foot on the cold flagstones. A small, plain, dark, walnut-brown wooden chair was carried across from the king's wagon and set 6 paces to the king's left, slightly turned in. The queen mother, Lady Alvina Aldrich's daughter, was helped down off her own dark gray mare by her own woman and walked the 4 paces to the chair on a heavy carved oak walking stick. She was tall in her age, white-gray hair tied at the nape, a long, dark moss-green wool gown to the ankle, a long, dark, slate-gray wool-hooded cloak. She sat, her clear ice-blue eyes, the eyes of Saryn's own line, by some long accident of the river valley, settled level on the kitchen door of the mill house. Captain Bran Halsig stood 3 paces from the kitchen door, his sword loose at his left hip. Reeve Vakor Stenkill stood at the captain's left shoulder, his hands plain at his sides under the captain's 2 outriders' watch, his pale, washed-out blue eyes on the dressed flagstones at his feet. The dark iron granary-reeve pin still at the throat of his dark slate-gray wool short coat. The king had not asked for the pin to be cut yet. The cart was stood at the riverside, the 2 dark bay horses unharnessed and held by a rider on the river road at the Willow. Mathis Threshold sat on the small, dark, walnut-brown 3-legged stool at the door of the willow-cottage 100 paces upstream of the wheel-yard. A small bound book of pale willow-board covers in his old hands and the heavy oak walking stick at his side. The clouded right eye was half closed. The clear, ice-blue left eye was on the wheel-yard. Saryn stood at the kitchen door of the mill house. Her hair was plaited at the right shoulder in the single thick rope braid. The bleached cream linen apron was tied behind. The dark walnut-brown leather belt sat at the waist. The small dark iron grain key was at her left hip. The small leather wallet at the small of the back held the small folded vellum of Mathis's signed dates. She had transferred it across that morning before first light. Loom sat at her left boot, ice-blue eyes on the king at the seat. The king looked across the wheel-yard at her and inclined his head once. "Greymill, my king. The first measure, the king's sealed sack. Bring it to the kitchen door. The captain will break the seal in plain sight at the kitchen door." "Yes, my king." She went into the meal bin floor and climbed both ladders to the loft. The 3rd wheat sack, the king's sealed sack from yesterday, sat on the loft shelf, the king's seal stamp impression in the soft, pale red wax clean and unbroken. She lifted it. It was the king's weight to the tip of the finger. She carried it back down across the plank floor of the meal bin chamber, out through the kitchen door and set it at the captain's feet. Captain Bran Halsig went down on one knee. He set his right thumb to the soft, pale red wax over the throat cord. He looked once at the king. The king inclined his head 1/2 inch. The captain broke the seal in a small, clean snap of soft wax, and the throat cord came loose. The captain stood, lifted the sack, and held it for Saryn to take. She took it again. "Bring it to the hopper," the king said. "Both of you. Plain sight." Saryn carried the sack back through the kitchen door, up to the millstone floor, the captain 3 paces behind her with his eyes on the sack. At the millstone floor, she set the sack into the open hopper of the fine wheat pear and tipped the throat in. The grain went down, plump kernels at the top of the sack at the hopper, plump kernels 2/3 down. At the bottom of the sack, the half that did not show at the loft hatch, the grain was a shade off, paler in the wrong way, slightly chalk pale at the kernel's join. The captain saw it. He inclined his head once. She set the empty oak-hooped sack carefully aside on the loft shelf and pulled the short, dark iron lever that opened the hopper shoe. The grain began to feed. The runner stone closed on the grain in the small, even low rumble within the great low rumble of the wheel. Saryn went down to the meal bin floor and stood at the spout end of the fine wheat side of the meal bin. The first meal began to come down the spout into the empty bone-white linen sack at the spout end. It was gray-white, not pale gold, gray-white at the pour, pale dust rising in the slanted noon light off the meal bin in a fine, pale gray haze that did not rise off clean meal, gritty in the eye. The pale cream linen sack went gray at the throat as the meal poured in, not pale gold the way it had gone at every clean measure she had ground for 9 winters. The sack filled a quarter full. She closed the lever. The spout slowed and stopped. She lifted the sack carefully out of the spout end and carried it across the meal bin floor and out through the kitchen door and across the wheel yard and laid it at the king's foot at the small, dressed, gray riverstone seat. She set down a small, clean, bleached gray wool kerchief beside it and untied the throat of the sack and tipped a careful pinch of the gray-white meal into the kerchief. 2 tablespoons, The king looked at the meal in the kerchief at his right boot. "Cup of wheatmeal," he said. "My king." He bent forward. He took the kerchief in his own 2 hands. He brought it up to his face. He smelled it once. He wet the tip of his right index finger on the inside of his lower lip and pressed it to the meal and brought the finger to the tongue. He held a beat. 2 beats. 3. His face did not move. The deep, amber-brown eyes were level on the wheel yard ahead of him. "Chalk." "Yes, my king." "And bone." "Yes, my king." "And cut with a coarse rye." "Yes, my king." The Queen Mother's clear, ice-blue eyes had not moved from the kitchen door of the mill house. The captain at the kitchen door had laid his right hand quietly across his sword hilt at his left hip. Reeve Vakor Stenkel had not moved. The 2 outriders at his back had not moved. "The Reeve's choice," the king said. "Captain, bring him. Loft." The captain put his hand on the back of Reeve Vakor Stenkel's coat and walked him across the wheel yard at his elbow. They went into the kitchen door, across the meal bin floor, up the millstone floor ladder, up the loft ladder. Saryn followed. The king stayed at his seat. 3 paces of King's Column followed her into the loft. In the loft, the captain stood at Vakor's left elbow. The Reeve looked at the remaining sacks, 3 unground wheat along the inland wall, 4 sealed rye along the riverside wall. He stood a long beat. His pale, washed-out blue eyes went over the sacks twice. He said, low, hoarse, his throat working dry, "The 5th wheat sack." The captain lifted the 5th wheat sack off the inland wall and brought it to the loft shelf. He set the king's small dark iron seal stamp into a fresh, soft, pale red wax over the throat cord. The wheel mark cut clean. The 5th wheat sack was now also under the king's seal. "Bring it to the hopper," the king's voice came up the loft hatch. "Both of you, plain sight." The captain put the sack in Saryn's 2 hands. She carried it down to the millstone floor, set it into the hopper, tipped the throat in. The grain went down. Plump kernels all the way to the bottom of the sack. Pale gold at the kernels join. Clean. She set the empty sack aside on the loft shelf and pulled the lever of the hopper shoe. The grain began to feed. She went down to the meal bin floor. The meal poured at the spout, pale gold. Warm. Clean. The dust rose fine and thin and pale in the slanted noon light. The bone-white linen sack went pale gold at the throat. She closed the lever, lifted the sack out, and carried it across the wheel yard to the king's other foot, the right foot opposite the cut sack at the left. A second clean-bleached gray wool kerchief came down beside it. A second pinch went into the kerchief. The king bent. He took the second kerchief in his 2 hands. He brought it up. He smelled it. He wet the tip of his right index finger and pressed it to the meal and brought the finger to the tongue. He held 1 beat. Clean. Cool. Slick. A little nutty. The king's wheat from the king's mill, from the king's miller's hand. The Queen Mother let out a long breath. It was the first sound she had made since she had sat down. She inclined her head once. The king set both kerchiefs carefully on the head of his grandfather's small, dressed gray riverstone seat between his 2 boots, the cut on the left and the clean on the right. The pale red wax of 2 king's seals lay between them. He looked across the wheel yard at Saryn. "Lay it down." Saryn turned and went into the meal bin floor. She did not run. She did not hurry. She crossed the meal bin floor at the same plain walk she had crossed it for 12 winters. She knelt at the inland end of the meal bin floor. She lifted up the 3rd, dark, walnut-brown plank from the wall. She turned it over. She carried it across the meal bin floor and out through the kitchen door and across the wheel yard and laid it at the king's foot, plank side down, the undercut side up, 316 small notches in 9 straight rows turned to the king's eye. She unlocked the iron-bound chest at the foot of her bed and brought out the bundle of 9 pale willow rods bound in dark iron wire. She laid it at the king's foot beside the plank. She took down the king's warrant tally from the inside of the granary loft door and laid it beside the bundle. She drew the small folded vellum of Mathis's signed dates from the small leather wallet at the small of her back and laid it beside the warrant. She lifted the empty king-sealed 3rd wheat sack from the loft shelf and laid it beside the vellum. The 5 things lay at the king's right boot in plain order: warrant, plank, bundle, vellum, sack. She took 2 paces back. She stood plain. The king bent. He picked up the warrant first. He read the notches. He set it down. He picked up the plank. He counted the notches by row. He set it down. He picked up the bundle. He undid the dark iron wire and counted the willow rods. 9. He looked at the small, dark iron mill pin at the head of each rod, Mathis's mark, cut careful by an old hand. He set it down. He picked up the vellum. He broke the small dark iron seal of T inside wheel and read. He folded it carefully again. He set it down. He picked up the empty cut sack and looked at the king's small dark iron seal stamp impression in the broken wax at the throat cord. Clean. His own seal, set there yesterday in his own sight. He set the sack down. He stood up from his grandfather's seat. Mathis threshold. Mathis stood at the door of the willow-cottage on the heavy oak walking stick. He did not come up the river road. The king had said his name. The naming was the first thing. Mathis threshold of the Greymill line. Will you swear to the line of these tally sticks as your hand cut them? My king. Walk. The old man came down the river road, slow and steady, on the heavy oak walking stick, the clouded right eye half closed, the clear ice-blue left eye on the king. He came into the wheelyard. He stopped at 4 paces from the king and inclined his head. My king. The line of the rods is mine. 3 days a week, 9 winters, 812 cart trips. Each notch at the head a pound of in-weight, short at the granary scale at Ardenmarch Hall, weighed by my own hand at the granary scale on the down cart, and at Greymill on the up cart. Each cross at the foot, a pound of chalk meal substituted at the outweight, sieved by my own hand at Greymill on the up cart. The fine tally is mine. The seal at the head of each rod is the small dark iron mill pin Saryn Greymill gave me at my apprenticeship end 54 winters ago. The vellum dates are mine. 37 nights of the Reeves cart down the river road from Brookford at second bell of night, watched from the willow stand at the door of my own house. You swear it. In the line of Merwin, and the line of Linnet, and the line of Saryn, my king, I swear it. The king inclined his head once. He turned to Reeve, Vekor Stenkel, at the kitchen door. Stenkel. The Reeve did not lift his head. The pale, washed-out blue eyes were on the dressed flagstones. Stenkel. Captain Bran Halsig touched the Reeve's shoulder once. The Reeve lifted the head. Speak. The Reeve's throat worked dry once, twice. His pale, chalk-fair face had gone a soft sallow. The thin, sandy gray hair was wet at the temples. My king, there is... The silver, Stenkel, the silver, from your sister's husband, Olin Stanmark of Brookford, per King's Quarter. The Reeve drew a long, thin breath. His eyes closed once. 3 pieces of silver, per King's Quarter, from Olin, for the routing of the king's grain at second bell, 9 winters. And the cut at the in-weight. The cut at the in-weight is mine, coarse rye and barley substituted for the king's wheat at the granary scale, the silver of the wheat price into my own purse, 9 winters. And the chalk and the bone meal are mine, ground at the kitchen quern at Ardenmarch Hall in my own hand, folded into the outweight at second bell at Greymill in the lockup, 9 winters. And the threat to the line. The Reeve did not speak. Stenkel. And the threat to the line, my king. 3 winters of Linnet Greymill, and 9 winters now of Saryn Greymill. To close Greymill, to rout the grinding to Brookford, to put a Greymill out of the line. The king looked at him a long beat. Captain. My king. Take him. Strip the granary-reeve pin at the wheel-yard now in plain hand. Hold him at Ardenmarch Hall for the king's writ at first light tomorrow. The silver of 9 winters will be paid back to the line of Greymill out of his own holdings. The cut grain of 3 days ago will be ground for the keep table at the king's grinding rate. The line of the line stands. My king. The captain stepped behind the Reeve, undid the small dark iron granary-reeve pin from the throat of the dark slate-gray wool short coat with one quick, small, careful turn, and set the pin into Saryn's open right palm in plain sight of the wheel-yard. Saryn closed her hand over the pin. The captain put his hand on the Reeve's left elbow and walked him out of the wheel-yard to the column on the river road. The wheel-yard was very quiet a moment, only the long, even low note of the river and the slow, heavy turn of the wheel. The king turned to her. Saryn Greymill. My king. Set the kitchen hearth. The line of the line will eat the king's true bread today, ground at the king's mill in the king's plain sight, baked in the king's miller's hearth in the king's plain sight from the meal of the 5th wheat sack now at our right hand. The captain's column will eat, the queen mother will eat, Mathis threshold will eat, the line of Greymill will eat, the king will eat. Yes, my king, she turned. Hetty was already at the kitchen door with her small bleached cream linen apron and her ice-gray eyes wide. The girl had been listening from the kitchen the whole time. Saryn touched her shoulder once. Set the kitchen hearth, strike the flint in the kindling, knead the meal into a small loaf at the trestle table. We bake on the small dark iron over the fire, 6 small loaves. 8. Yes. The girl ran into the kitchen. Saryn followed. The kitchen hearth came alive in the cold summer hearth grate from the small flint and the dry kindling and the pale willow bark Hetty had set ready that morning. The small dark iron kettle came down off its hook to be set aside. The small dark iron came up onto the fire. Saryn took the 2nd sack at the meal bin shelf, the 5th wheat sack's clean meal sieved through her brass meal sieve into the kneading board, and added a little river water and a little salt and worked the dough quick and clean with the heel of her right hand. She kneaded 8 small loaves on the bleached cream wood breadboard, set them on the small dark iron over the fire, and baked them quick the way Merwin had baked the king's bread for King's Fair in the famine year, and the way Linnet had baked the king's bread for King Aldrich in the long peace. The bread came off the iron in 8 small pale gold rounds, warm, the smell of king's true wheat rising in the kitchen and out through the kitchen door across the wheel yard. She carried the 8 small loaves out to the king at the seat on a small, clean bleached cream linen cloth in her own 2 hands. She gave the 1st to the king, she gave the 2nd to the queen mother, she gave the 3rd to Captain Brown Halsig, she gave the 4th to Mathis Threshold, she gave the 5th, 6th, and 7th to 3 of the riders the captain named in the column. She gave the 8th to Hetty, she kept none. The king broke his small loaf with his 2 hands at the seat. He looked across the wheel yard at her. "My grandfather's bread," he said low and even. "Merwin's bread." He ate. Part 5. The Promise at the Mill Wheel. The column ate at the wheel yard a long, quiet hour. The bread was eaten, the wheel was eased. Saryn had let the sluice down to a half fall after the 2nd measure, so the wheel turned slow and quiet now. The deep, low rumble gentled to a soft, long, even note under the wheel yard. The captain set out 4 small, clean, dark, walnut-brown wooden plates and 4 small dark iron cups along the dressed flagstones. Water from the kitchen kettle for the king and the queen mother and Mathis and Saryn. They drank at the small dressed gray riverstone seat together. When the cups were set down, the king stood. He inclined his head once to the queen mother. He said, "Mother, the wheel yard a moment with the miller." The queen mother inclined her head once back. The captain took 2 paces to the wheel yard mouth and stood plain. The column at the river road was at a quiet rest. Mathis went back to his stool at the willow-cottage door and sat. Hetty went into the meal bin floor with the empty breadboard and the small dark iron and the small kneading board. Saryn stood with the king at the small dressed gray riverstone seat at the south end of the wheel yard. The slow, pale green river ran 10 paces beyond. The wheel turned slow. Saryn Greymill, my king. My grandfather Sverre walked our mills himself in the famine winter of his 14th year. He walked from Ardenmarch Hall to Greymill on the river road on a cold morning of his 14th winter and ate at your grandmother's kitchen table the bread your grandmother had made of the king's true wheat, ground at the king's mill, at the king's miller's hand, at the king's plain site. He sat at this seat, for 9 afternoons of that winter. He set the seat himself with his own 2 hands. He sent a man down the river road to the carter's yard at Ardenmarch Hall and had the small pewter wheel mark cut into the backrest in the soft lead at the head with his own silver. She did not speak. Her right hand had closed unconsciously over the small dark iron granary-reeve pin in her bleached cream linen apron pocket. She did not feel it. At his deathbed in the long, warm peace, 63 winters later, in the chapel of Ardenmarch Hall on a midsummer eve, he said to my father, who was my father then, not yet King Aldrich, 3 things. First, keep the line of Greymill at Greymill on the Ardenwater. Second, never put a granary-reeve between the king and the king's miller. Third, when the line is in trouble, walk it yourself. He looked at her. My father did not. He let the line slip in his last 6 winters out of trust in the man you have just seen taken by the captain. He died of a stroke in the same chapel before the winter the slip would have shown plain. My grandfather's 3rd charge fell to me. I have walked the line today. I will walk it again tomorrow with the writ in my own hand. I will walk it every winter at the late summer harvest tour with my own boots on the dressed flagstones of this wheel yard until my hands give out, the way my grandfather walked it, the way your mother walked it before me, the way your grandmother walked it before her. My king. The line of Greymill stands. By the king's word, in plain hand. Tomorrow at first light at the kitchen table, I will sign it on a long pale gray vellum. The wheat to come direct to your bin from Ardenmarch Hall by the cart of Mathis' threshold while his hands hold, and after his hands by Hetty's hand. The silver to come direct to your hand at the King's Quarter from Ardenmarch Hall in plain count by the captain. No granary-reeve between. The mill at Brookford to revert to a free village mill open to any traveller at King's Fair price under a village master appointed by the 4 villages of the lower valley themselves, not by Stenkel's blood. The silver of 9 winters of Stenkel's holding to come to the line of Greymill in restitution. Hetty of the willow-cottage line named in plain hand as your apprentice from this hour. Mathis Threshold's tally sticks to be kept in the Royal Archive at Ardenmarch Hall, named, dated, sealed in his own hand, in the same case as my grandfather's deathbed charge in his own hand. She looked at him level and plain. The line stands, my king. The line stands. He reached up to his throat and untied the thin leather cord at the open neck of his bone-white linen tunic. He drew out the small plain pewter mill token from under the tunic. A small pewter disc, the size of a king's coin, with the Ardenwater wheel mark cut into the face, soft from 63 winters of being carried in a king's belt purse, and then a king's prince's belt purse, and then a king's neck cord. The thin leather cord was old, dark, plain. He held it once in his right hand a long beat. My grandfather carried this in his belt purse on the cold morning he walked to Greymill in the famine year. He pressed it into your grandmother's open palm at her kitchen table when she gave him the loaf of king's true bread. She gave it back to him. She said the line of Greymill keeps no king's coin in the kitchen. The line keeps the wheel. He took it back. He carried it the rest of his winters. At his deathbed, he passed it to my father. My father passed it to me at his own deathbed in the chapel of Ardenmarch Hall. I have carried it 3 winters at the throat under the linen tunic. He held it out to her in his right hand at her open right palm. The line of Greymill keeps no king's coin in the kitchen. The line keeps the wheel, but the line of Greymill may keep the king's mill token at the throat under the linen tunic on a thin leather cord, the way the king's grandfather's grandson has carried it, in plain remembrance of a winter walk by a king of 14 on the river road from Ardenmarch Hall to a kitchen table where the bread of the king's true wheat was the bread of the king. My king. She put her right palm out under his right palm. He set the small pewter mill token into her palm with the thin leather cord folded once. The pewter was warm from his throat. She closed her fingers over it. Wear it. She lifted the cord over her head. The small pewter disc came down inside the bleached pale cream linen tunic at her throat under the apron. She let the cord settle. The pewter was warm at her collarbone, above the long ash-blonde rope braid that lay heavy at the right shoulder. My king! Saryn Greymill of the line of Greymill, the king's miller of Greymill on the Ardenwater for the rest of her hands. For the rest of my hands, my king. The slow, pale green Ardenwater ran past the wheel yard. The wheel turned slow under the half-fall sluice. The sun had moved a hand's breadth west since the bread had been broken. He inclined his head once. He turned. He walked back across the wheel yard to the small, dressed gray river stone seat. He spoke a low, quiet word to Captain Bran Halsig. The captain inclined his head and turned to the column on the river road. The column made camp at the willow stand by the wheel yard for the night. Part 6. The Writ at first light. The mist came at first light off the slow pale green Ardenwater in long pale gray ropes that lay on the willow stand and on the dressed flagstones of the river road and on the wheel yard. The river spoke at the sluice gate before the bell at Ardenmarch Hall, the way the river had spoken every morning of Saryn's life for 23 winters, and every morning of Linnet's life before her, and every morning of Merwin's life before her. She rose, she dressed in the dim, the bleached pale cream linen tunic, the dark slate-gray wool short skirt, the dark moss-green wool leggings, the tall, plain, dark walnut-brown leather boots, the bleached cream linen apron, the wide leather belt with the small brass meal sieve and the small dark iron grain key and the small leather wallet. She drew her ash-blonde hair forward over the right shoulder and plaited it down to the end and tied the end with the small dark iron clip. She tied the pale gray linen kerchief over the crown of the head. The small pewter mill token on the thin leather cord at the throat lay cold a single beat against the collarbone and went warm. Loom came in from the kitchen door without sound and sat at her left boot. She crossed the wheel yard at the steady, plain walk in the long, pale gray morning mist. She set her shoulder to the long oak sluice lever against the inland wall. The sluice rose, the water came down, the wheel began to turn. She stood a moment at the wheel yard with her hand on the lever. The deep, low rumble of the wheel began under the wet flagstones. Mother, grandmother. 2 words to the river and the wheel and the morning and the line of Greymill of the Ardenwater throne. The kitchen of the king's tent at the willow stand was already alight. Saryn went in and ground the morning's first measure clean and warm at the spout end of the meal bin and sieved a small, careful pinch into a small bleached gray wool kerchief and carried it across the wheel yard at the head of the second hour past dawn. The mist was beginning to lift off the river. The king sat at the small, dark, walnut-brown trestle table in the kitchen of the mill house at the small, bleached gray wool tablecloth. Captain Bran Halsig stood at his left shoulder. The Queen Mother sat at the other plain, dark, walnut-brown chair at the king's right hand. Mathis Threshold was at his stool at the door of the willow-cottage with the clouded right eye half closed and the clear ice-blue left eye on the wheel yard. Hetty was at the meal bin floor, sieving the second measure of the morning into the second small linen sack at the spout end. The king had a long, pale gray vellum laid out flat on the trestle table, a small dark iron quill in his right hand, a small dark iron inkpot at his right elbow, a clean small leather pouch of soft pale red wax beside it, the Aldrichson signet of dark iron on the third finger of the right hand. He read out the writ in his own low, even voice in the kitchen of the king's mill at the head of the long valley of the Ardenwater on the second bell of the morning of a clear late summer day, the writ that Sverre the mill walker would have had set down 63 winters earlier in his 14th winter, if any of his 3 charges had needed setting down then in plain hand. He read it once through, he read it twice. The second reading he read, so that Saryn could correct any one line of it if any one line did not match the line of the line. She corrected nothing. He set the small dark iron quill into the small dark iron inkpot and signed at the foot in his own slow, careful hand, Galen Aldrichson, King of the Ardenwater. He set the soft, pale red wax over the foot of the vellum and pressed the Aldrichson signet of dark iron into it once. The Ardenwater wheel mark cut clean. He folded the writ once carefully along the long axis. He folded it again. He held it in his right palm a beat. He set it into Saryn's open right palm. For Greymill, for the line of Greymill, for the wheel. My king! She carried the writ across the meal bin floor to her own 2-room dwelling at the inland end. She knelt at the foot of the bed. She unlocked the iron-bound chest with the small, dark iron grain key. She laid the writ flat inside the chest beside Merwin's hammer and pick for stone dressing and Linnet's set of brass meal sieves and the bundle of 9 pale willow-rod tally sticks bound in dark iron wire. She closed the lid. She locked it. She came back to the kitchen door. The king stood from the trestle table. He inclined his head once to the Queen Mother. He inclined his head once to Saryn. He turned. He went out across the wheel yard. The wolf's den came at his left heel. The captain followed 3 paces behind with the king's small, dark iron seal stamp wrapped in a clean small leather cloth in the right hand. The king mounted the dark bay tall stallion at the wheel yard mouth. The column took up the steady walk and went east on the river road towards the next mill of the late summer harvest tour at Hillmarch. The green and pewter wheelmark pennant at the head, the second pennant a single horse behind, the captain 3 paces behind the king. The king passed the willow-cottage at the steady walk. He inclined his head once to Mathis at the stool. Mathis inclined his head once back, the clouded right eye half closed, the clear ice-blue left eye on the king. The column went on. Saryn stood at the kitchen door of the mill house. The mist had lifted now. The slow, pale green Ardenwater ran. The wheel turned. Loom sat at her left boot. The long, ash-blonde rope braid lay heavy at her right shoulder. The small pewter mill token of the king's grandfather's hand lay warm at the throat under the linen tunic. The third measure of the morning's grinding was waiting at the wheat-side ladder. The line of Greymill was the king's mill in plain hand. She turned and went back to the wheat-side ladder and climbed.